The quiet click of the microphone signaled that the room was live, but Scott Ritter barely flinched. He had stood in more hostile places than this, briefing rooms in Baghdad, press pits swarming with skeptical journalists, and intelligence chambers humming with political tension. But this was different. Now he was no longer a Marine Corps officer, no longer a weapons inspector under UN mandate. He was a civilian. And still, he stood tall, commanding the room with the unshakable posture of a man who knew too much and had nothing left to lose. The camera light blinked red. Ritter's voice, calm and unhurried, pierced the stillness like a laser cutting through fog. We've been lied to before, about Iraq, about Syria, and now we're standing on the brink again, only this time it's worse. This time, the truth is even more dangerous. The people watching, both in the small auditorium and behind screens across the internet, were already leaning forward. For decades, Ritter had walked the knife edge between credibility and controversy. As a Marine Corps intelligence officer, he'd spent years parsing satellite imagery and intercepted communications. Later, as chief UN weapons inspector in Iraq, he became a whistleblower of sorts, daring to defy the Bush administration's narrative in the build-up to the 2003 invasion. That rebellion against officialdom cost him dearly: reputation, income, and public trust. But it hadn't cost him his voice. What Ritter was now saying about Israel, America's staunchest ally in the Middle East, was sending tremors through the defense and diplomatic communities. He described an Israel that, behind closed doors, was deeply aware of its vulnerabilities, yet addicted to a doctrine of perpetual threat. He accused key elements of the Israeli military establishment of promoting conflict escalation as a tool of control, leveraging fear to maintain military dominance and political leverage, not just over Gaza or Lebanon, but over Washington itself. Israel operates under what it calls a security doctrine, Ritter continued, but when you strip away the rhetoric, it becomes clear. It's not about defending the nation. It's about justifying perpetual aggression. And the United States is complicit. Gasps weren't audible, but they rippled through the chat feeds like aftershocks. Ritter didn't blink. He leaned into the uncomfortable silence, letting his words settle like dust on polished brass. Every sentence he delivered was deliberate, as if aware that each syllable could be parsed, condemned, or dismissed in an instant. This isn't about anti-Israel sentiment, he clarified, anticipating the barrage of accusations sure to follow. This is about questioning policy. It's about asking whether the billions in aid and weapons transfers are making anyone safer, or if they're locking us into a cycle we can't escape. To illustrate his point, Ritter spoke of a classified report he'd once read, one that painted a picture of strategic manipulation, targeted leaks to media, exaggerated threats from neighboring states, and internal lobbying that pushed American decision-makers toward blind support. He didn't name sources. He didn't need to. His credibility, forged in military operations and geopolitical negotiation rooms, carried its own weight. And still, some in the room looked uncomfortable. A few scrolled their phones, others whispered to colleagues. But no one left. That was Ritter's paradox. He could infuriate you, but you couldn't ignore him. In the days leading up to this talk, whispers had already begun circulating in independent journalism circles. Substack writers, podcasters, and even a few cautious mainstream outlets began echoing the warning. Ritter was back, and he was saying things most insiders only dared whisper over whiskey in diplomatic back channels. He didn't just stop at Israel's behavior. Ritter scrutinized America's role as enabler, how successive administrations, both Democrat and Republican, had reinforced Israeli impunity. He named high-level Pentagon officials who had turned a blind eye to civilian casualties. He questioned the intelligence-sharing relationship, suggesting it was less a partnership and more an ideological echo chamber. Still, Ritter offered no simple villains. He was too experienced, too familiar with the gray zones of power, to reduce this to good versus evil. What he offered instead was clarity, a brutally honest dissection of a situation spiraling beyond control. As he spoke, he shared a moment that had haunted him. During a visit to Israel years earlier, he'd toured an underground military command center. There, a general proudly showed him a digital map filled with red-marked targets across Gaza. "Every dot is a possible threat," the general had said. And every dot, Ritter whispered to the crowd now, was someone's home, someone's school, someone's hospital. His voice wavered just slightly, not with emotion but with the weight of consequence. "I don't say this to demonize Israel. I say this because we've reached a point where militarized fear has become normalized policy. And if we don't stop to question it, if we don't demand truth over narrative, then we've learned nothing." The lights overhead dimmed slightly, casting longer shadows on the walls as his final words echoed through the chamber. "We failed to ask hard questions before Iraq. We failed to push back before Libya. Are we really going to stand silent again, this time, with nuclear weapons in the mix?" Silence met him, not from indifference, but from stunned absorption. In the corner of the room, a young reporter finally raised a hand. "So what now?" "What happens next?" Scott Ritter looked at her with an expression that betrayed no optimism, but not quite despair. "What happens next depends on whether people like you keep asking questions, or if you let someone else decide which truths are safe enough to speak." The mic cut off. The lights stayed dim, and the world outside that small room kept turning, still armed, still divided, and now maybe just a little more awake. When the recording of Scott Ritter's address circulated online, it ignited a firestorm. Social media platforms lit up with both fervent praise and searing criticism. He had become, once again, a lightning rod, a man whose words refused to settle neatly on either side of political lines. But far from retreating, Ritter leaned in. The more the backlash mounted, the more determined he became to bring his evidence into the light. In Washington, a quiet unease began to build. Several congressional aides, previously unmoved by foreign policy debates, found themselves pulled into late-night discussions about classified intelligence reports and the previously ignored nuances of America's defense commitments to Israel. Ritter's speech had cracked open a space for questioning, just enough for the previously unspoken to gain volume. But it wasn't just the halls of Congress or think tanks that were rumbling. Inside the Pentagon, where quiet restraint often masked brutal efficiency, a growing faction of mid-level analysts began circulating internal memos inspired by Ritter's allegations. These weren't leaks. They were internal reflections, quiet confessions that the system might not be as tightly sealed as everyone assumed. Some questioned whether the intelligence they were feeding to their superiors was being filtered to fit pre-approved narratives. Ritter, meanwhile, was contacted by an old acquaintance, Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Hale, a fellow Marine turned strategic advisor who now worked at a NATO liaison post in Brussels. The two hadn't spoken in years, not since a fiery disagreement during a mission debrief in 2004. But Hale's message was brief, precise, and unmistakably urgent. "You're not wrong, and you're not alone." They met 3 days later in a nondescript cafe in Vienna. The neutral setting was more than symbolic. It was strategic. Hale arrived first, eyes scanning every passerby, the old habits still ingrained. Ritter slid into the booth across from him without a word. For several moments they simply watched each other, the silence between them heavy with memory. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest," Hale finally said. Ritter nodded. "I thought people would want the truth." "They do," Hale replied, "but not all at once, and not when it threatens the system." The conversation unfolded cautiously. Hale spoke of NATO briefings that masked operational failures, of internal pressure to suppress dissenting intelligence, especially when it painted Israeli operations in a less than flattering light. He wasn't suggesting conspiracy, only an uncomfortable alignment of interests and inertia that distorted clarity. "What you're exposing," Hale said, "isn't just Israeli policy. It's how Western defense ecosystems sustain themselves, on fear, funding, and simplified narratives." Ritter's eyes sharpened. "And if those narratives collapse?" Hale hesitated. "Then so does the illusion of control." They parted with no handshakes, no promises. But Ritter had what he needed, confirmation from inside the walls. He returned to the States with renewed focus. The next phase wouldn't be a speech, it would be a dossier. He began assembling declassified documents, transcripts of Senate hearings, procurement records, and public reports that, when connected, painted a stark picture. Arms sales driven less by strategic necessity and more by political pressure. Intelligence assessments edited for diplomatic palatability. The dossier avoided hyperbole. It didn't accuse, it revealed. Page after page, Ritter built a case that showed how unquestioned alliances could warp both truth and policy. At the same time, his public profile began to shift. Where before he was seen as a rogue whistleblower, now he was becoming something harder to dismiss, a methodical critic armed with evidence. Independent journalists amplified his findings. A retired CIA analyst came forward in quiet support. Former UN colleagues, once hesitant, began to speak with cautious affirmation. And yet, for every new ally, a new threat emerged. Anonymous messages warned him to stop. Interviews were suddenly canceled. A scheduled lecture at a prominent university was withdrawn hours before it was set to begin, citing logistical concerns. He knew what it meant. He'd been here before. But this time was different. The world, shaken by recent wars and disillusioned by years of institutional overreach, was more willing to listen. Ritter wasn't offering a partisan manifesto, he was asking dangerous questions that neither side of the aisle wanted to confront. One question in particular echoed louder than the rest. How much had the West traded away in the name of strategic loyalty? The tension escalated when a former Israeli defense advisor, speaking off record to a European newspaper, confirmed elements of Ritter's claims. Though quickly denied by Israeli officials, the interview emboldened Ritter's stance. The cracks in the armor were no longer hypothetical. They were real and widening. A new opportunity emerged, a televised debate with a senior policy advisor from the Israeli embassy. At first, Ritter declined. He didn't want spectacle. But then he reconsidered. Visibility mattered. The truth needed oxygen. The debate aired on a major news network during prime time. The studio lights were merciless, the moderators tense. The advisor opened with predictable lines: security, regional instability, historical persecution. Ritter, however, spoke without script, his words slow and sharp. "This isn't about denying Israel's right to exist or defend itself," he said. "It's about asking whether our alliance enables peace or entrenches conflict, whether we're helping a friend or losing ourselves in blind loyalty." The advisor countered, pointing to the existential threats Israel faced, to Iran's rhetoric, to Hamas rockets. Ritter didn't flinch. "And what about proportionality? Accountability? Do we measure threats only by firepower or by the cost to our credibility when we excuse every excess?" The moderator tried to pivot, but the audience, both in studio and online, was captivated. The debate didn't end with a winner, but it marked a turning point. Ritter had gone from the fringe to the forefront. Outside the studio, reporters swarmed. Ritter said little. He didn't need to. Back at his hotel, he watched the playback alone. He wasn't satisfied, but he saw the shift. People were listening. Not just critics or supporters, people, citizens, soldiers, diplomats. And maybe, just maybe, policymakers. He closed his laptop. There was more work to do. The hardest part wasn't revealing the truth, it was ensuring the world cared enough to act on it. Scott Ritter's phone vibrated just past midnight. He had grown used to the strange hours, calls, messages, cryptic emails. But this one bore a name he hadn't seen in years. Anna Leventhal, a former liaison from Mossad turned international intelligence consultant. Their last interaction had been tense, shaded by mistrust and thick with implication. Her message was simple: "We need to talk, off the record." They met the following day in Geneva, the city that lived in quiet diplomacy. Anna looked older, wearier. She no longer carried the sharp arrogance of officialdom. Instead, she sat across from Ritter like someone who had seen too much and had no more illusions to protect. "What you're doing," she began, "has already changed things." Ritter didn't flinch. "Not enough." Anna nodded. "But it started something. Inside Israel, too. There are those who agree with you, quietly, fearfully. But they know." He leaned forward. "Then why haven't they said anything?" She gave a bitter smile. "Because the system punishes doubt. And because fear is a powerful currency, internally, politically, globally, you're threatening that economy." What followed was less a briefing than a reckoning. Anna confirmed that several intelligence operations, long considered justified under the umbrella of national defense, had quietly bypassed international norms, and that internal debate over such actions had been systematically stifled. Her words didn't surprise Ritter, but they gave his work a nameable pulse. People on the inside were not just complicit. Many were trapped. Later that night, Ritter updated the dossier. He included references to the anonymous confirmations, carefully coded to avoid identification, but clear enough to connect the dots. The document, now over 300 pages, had become something far greater than an exposé. It was a mirror, held up to a system that thrived on selective blindness. But as the dossier gained traction, pressure mounted from multiple directions. Congressional staffers whispered about closed-door hearings. Former colleagues urged him to back down. Intelligence officers, through intermediaries, offered compromises, backroom deals that would allow him to retire with dignity. Ritter declined them all. In a small studio in New York, he sat for an independent interview that would become his most widely viewed broadcast. The interviewer, a former BBC war correspondent, asked him directly, "Why risk your reputation, your safety, your freedom, for this?" He paused. "Because silence is complicity, and because I've seen what happens when truth is buried deep enough to become myth." The video went viral within hours. Not just because of its content, but because of its delivery. Ritter didn't grandstand. He didn't moralize. He laid out facts, cold, precise, and painful. The public response was polarized, but undeniable. He had become a catalyst, and then came the leak. Someone, still unidentified, released a tranche of diplomatic cables. The documents, while not authored by Ritter, echoed many of his claims. Communications between U.S. and Israeli officials hinted at military actions withheld from allies, and pressure campaigns on international watchdogs to mute investigations. The cables referenced intelligence briefings where strategic ambiguity was used to justify unreported airstrikes. The story exploded globally. Governments issued denials, news outlets scrambled, Ritter became both hero and target. And yet, amid the chaos, something changed. Inside the United Nations, a motion was tabled, led by a coalition of neutral countries, to form an independent review panel on arms oversight and military accountability. It wasn't a revolution, but it was motion. The kind Ritter knew didn't come easily. Still, he was cautious. "Symbolism is easy," he told a reporter. "Change requires pain." In Tel Aviv, protests erupted. Small at first, then larger. Young Israelis, many fresh out of IDF service, demanded transparency. They weren't anti-state. They were anti-secrecy, anti-manipulation. They carried signs quoting Ritter's interviews. Allies tell each other the truth. At home, Ritter's life was under quiet surveillance. His family received veiled threats. Friends grew distant. But he persisted. Not because he believed he would win, but because the fight itself had meaning. One night, while reviewing a letter from a Marine lieutenant stationed in the Pacific, who thanked him for reminding service members that honor isn't just about obedience, Ritter allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. He had always known this path would cost him, but he hadn't anticipated how many others would find courage in his defiance. The final act came quietly. A congressional committee, long stalled on reform legislation, introduced a resolution on military aid accountability. It was symbolic, underpowered, and likely doomed in its current form. But it cited Ritter's dossier by name. Officially, publicly, it was enough. Ritter stood alone outside the Capitol building the night it was tabled. He watched the windows glow, knowing that behind them, powerful people were trying to decide how much truth the world could handle. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. But he stood straighter. The war for narrative was far from over. But something had broken loose, and it wasn't going back in the box. And somewhere, far from the headlines, a younger officer, maybe in uniform, maybe not, was reading Ritter's words for the first time and asking the only question that mattered now. What else have we accepted in silence? Ritter didn't know if the answer would come in his lifetime, but he had started the question, and that, for now, was enough.